Liquid Assets is proudly sponsored by HASA.
Hi, I'm Newsha Ajami. I'm the director of the new program at Stanford on governance for risk, resilience, recovery. Water is very central to everything I do. And this new program I'm building is all about like how climate impacts are sort of propagating through communities and how we can do better in managing risk, build more resilience, and recover better, especially when it comes to access to resources, including water.
Welcome to Liquid Assets. Liquid Assets is a podcast that looks at the world of water through the lens of business, technology, and policy. Today we have an amazing guest for you. We have Newsha Ajami visiting us from the Stanford Dorr School of Sustainability. Newsha, how are you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming on. Before we hit the record button, there was one thing that stuck out. And you said this a few times, and I think that the headline here is water is important to the economy. What does that? I think we can all understand that water is important to humans. We use water a lot, but what does that mean? Like, why is water important to the economy? What are you seeing today? What does that mean?
Yeah, so water is basically an invisible ingredient in almost everything we do, we use, we consume. Think about it. From the morning you wake up till you go to bed, you do a lot of different things, and every one of them has water footprints. From charging your phone, because we need water to generate electricity, to driving a car. If you have a gas car, that means that we need water to extract oil and gas. And if you have an electric car, we need water to extract lithium, and then also electricity that you use, which is a battery in your car, and then electricity that you use also needs water. I can go down that. If you use your phone, which people don't think about often, you generate a lot of data, or you interact with a lot of, the digital space, and all of that has water footprint. To food you eat, to clothes you wear, to furniture you use. And often people don't think about it because water comes out of their taps, leaves their homes after they flush the toilet, or it drains through the system. And they think that's the only way they use water. But the reality is water is everywhere, and we need it for everything. And that's why it's basically underpins everything we do.
I've been asked this question a lot, actually. And people are like, the water is, the earth is 70, 80, 90% water. And there's desalination technology. Water is so important. You're seeing all this conversation around data centers using water. And, back 20, 30 years ago, there was water used for industry. Agriculture uses a ton of water. Like, if the earth has so much water in it, why is it such a thing that we worry about?
I mean, yes, there's a lot of water on the earth, and so it's a blue planet as we see it from distance. But the reality is just very small amount of that water is fresh water, and very small amount of it is easily available for us to use. Lots of it is in the glaciers. Some of it is in the form of groundwater underneath our feet, and some is deep groundwater is harder to reach. And the oceans and the seas that we see are all, they have salty water, and that salty water requires a lot of energy for us to transform it into a drinkable water. So the water that's available to many of us easily is a very, very, very small portion of that bigger pool that we see. And that's why it's hard. And also, another thing is not everybody is equally have access to all of that, right? So the pattern of migration, especially in the past 100 years, that we have figured out how to engineer our way out of our water limitations. People are living in places, the communities are expanding beyond their water capacity. So not everybody has access to the same amount of water. Not everybody has access to the same quality of water. So it's also complicated when you're thinking about geographies and locations, because it becomes very, very complicated.
Newsha, you're one of the topmost people in the world of water, and you I was reading, and you just wrote this paper with the Aspen Institute on kind of water policy. can you, I guess maybe for the audience, can you kind of explain maybe first of all what the Aspen Institute is,
Sure.
and what exactly was this paper, and what does it say?
Yeah, Aspen Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan institute that has been trying to inform policy across a range of issues, from national security to environment to energy, just name it. And I've been involved with the energy and environment group for the past 4 or 5 years, sort of co-hosting, co-chairing the Aspen National Water Forum. 2 years ago, we decided that every time you have a conversation about water, especially in the U.S., often comes down to, oh, but we have no national water strategy. If you tell people that water is such an essential part of our life, it touches everything, it underpins everything we do, and then tell them we have no national policy or national federal institution that is in charge of all the things water, it would make you pause, right? We have Department of Energy, we have Department of Transportation, we have all these different departments that actually help us to access the infrastructure that we need for the growth and the prosperity that we need to achieve, right? But we do not have anything when it comes to water. And the reality is, we do have a bunch of policies at the national level that inform some of the actions we are taking. For example, we have Clean Water Act, which is all about making sure the waters of our country and nation is kept clean. It's not polluted. We can use it for swimming, for drinking, for use, and we can preserve the ecosystem that we highly depend on. Now, I said all this to say, when it comes to water, when we do not have a national water strategy, and we often leave water management to the states, that makes it very complicated because, first of all, the political boundaries that we have do not fully match our watersheds or water boundaries or natural boundaries that we have, right? And that means that my state can manage water differently, your state can manage water differently, and then all of a sudden, but we both might depend on the same watershed, but your decisions can impact me and mine can impact you. And that is actually a big problem because we don't really have a proper directive. And I'm sure if people are following the issues around Colorado River is a great example of that because, 7 states, 7 priorities, 7 issues, 7 models of management, and 1 watershed. And they're all highly dependent on this resource. And we have not figured out how to divide that water properly. And they're all fighting over who takes what, who leaves what on the table, and who's willing to compromise the most. So just a simple example. So having a national water strategy and having a federal level guidelines roadmap to how do we manage our water supplies, having a centralized data that shows what we use, what we take, what is polluted, what's not polluted, how much gets cleaned up, how do different cities use water, for example, how do different industries use water. Just think about it, right? It's just all about benchmarking. So that way we can make better decisions. Or telling people, for example, your groundwater basin that you depend on or the water supply you depend on, this is its limits. This is how much you need to leave for this. So kind of think about it as a very, very simple framework that helps us to make better decisions. And then you can say individual states, based on their own priorities, within this framework, can make other decisions, right? So I often use this example, which is, we all have the same number of bones in our bodies, right? The skeletal that we have 206 bones. It actually a majority of us provides a frame for our bodies, but no 2 people look the same, right? We all have different colors of skin, different colors of hair, eyes, body shape, body type, height, and that is the individual that makes decision and forms that. But if we lose that skeletal form, it becomes a very chaotic system because then you cannot, for example, make cars, you cannot make homes, because then you have to individually design things for individual needs, which becomes very complicated. So that's the merit behind this. Why do we need a national water policy? Because it provides that frame, that skeletal through which then we can make better decisions to protect and preserve our water supply, to protect our national security, to have to preserve our sort of dominance in the world, however you want to think about it, right? Because water is very important, and we need to make sure we have access to it and make sure we have water security for everybody in the country.
And what does the framework allude to? What's kind of the conclusion of the report? Is it like we should take this up to the federal level and we need to create a Department of Water? And what kind of happens after?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, that would be ideal to have a Department of Water. We have right now, water is divided among different agencies, from Environmental Protection Agency to the Department of Interior to NOAA to NASA, like just divide it up by Department of Energy. It even had a water focus, which is mostly focused on technology. So all these people have different missions, different directives, and they're doing different things. So creating a little bit more coordination and having a top layer that's like Department of Water that can help kind of bring all these together and create a mission around water can be very important. And we actually focused the report on, I should also say, to write that report, we were very deliberate about who ends up around the table when we're having those discussions. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about people from across the country, different geographies, different political backgrounds, different regions, right? Making sure we have different industries represented, different backgrounds are represented. So kind of trying, we had a few members of different tribes represented. So trying to create a tapestry of people who actually need water and are important as part of this process. So that was very, very important. Collectively, we worked together for about 2 years and to put this together. And we have divided this into 6 different pillars: water for the economy, water governance, water for the rural communities, because they're essential, and because they are the ones who are protecting our water sources, in water innovation, risk and resilience, and then water infrastructure. And maybe out of this, I pick 2, which I think is important to focus on. One is water governance. I often say we have a world that's defined, or at least in the water world, we have a lot of laws and policies that were set in the 19th century. And think about Colorado River, and the challenges we are facing there. Then we have infrastructure that we built in the 20th century, right? And then we created institutions around those infrastructure. And then now we are facing 21st century challenges, right? Which none of those laws and policies and none of those institutions and infrastructure are fit to react to or adapt to or respond to. So the question is, how do we rethink and reimagine this governance structure that we have? Because we don't have a blank sheet of paper. So we have to admit that, right? It's not easy to say, okay, we're going to rip everything apart and rewrite it. But the question is, how do we adapt and adjust to the new reality we are facing? And how do we repurpose some of these institutions and laws and policies as such that they can answer the challenges we are facing today? So the water governance pillar focuses on that. What is there? What needs to change? How do we need to rethink this? I talked about water in the economy earlier. It's the same concept, sort of like we have all these emerging technologies that are coming up, from data centers to chip manufacturing to mining to anything you can imagine, and all of that needs water. So the question is, how do we make sure? And we are already facing a lot of water security problems across the country, be it West Coast or East Coast, actually, quality issues, quantity issues. So the question is, as you're introducing this new set of demand into our already strained system, what is it we have to do to make sure we can have water security, and then through that, actually national security. So that's water for the economy is focused on. The rural community, as I mentioned, is all about rural communities are very important, often forgotten, but very, very important part of our water system, because they often live on the sort of headwaters, and whatever they do can impact water availability, water quality. And we need to make sure these communities have access to clean water, they're protected, and they are actually partnering with cities and industries as equal partners to make sure we all doing things together. And sometimes agriculture fits in that space. You brought up agriculture, because look, we all need food. What does agriculture do? They are basically producing food that we all need. So they're not there's no fight. There should not be this whole concept of urban versus ag, industry versus ag. It cannot be put that way. It has to be very inclusive, because we're all part of the system together. Anyway, so trying to kind of think about that a little bit more. And risk and resilience is all about the fact that a lot of the climate impacts that we are experiencing is through water. Too much water, too little water, too polluted water, right? So what is it we have to do better when it comes to that? Better assessing risk, having better data to understand who is at risk, what are the vulnerabilities, what are the exposures, what are the different things we need to do. Infrastructure is another one. The reason we focused on that is, a lot, when I mention the word infrastructure, very quickly people think, concrete, steel, pipes, pumps, dams. But the reality is, if you think about it, infrastructure is our digital infrastructure, right? A lot of that ends up being very much behind the pipes and pumps and, concrete that we have. But also natural infrastructure, right? We need nature to actually be the source of that water. So protecting forest, protecting land, protecting marshlands and wetlands, trying to kind of think about green infrastructure. The reality is, in our utility business right now, we don't have a line item that says make capital investments in natural infrastructure, right? Mm-hmm. So the question is, how do you expand the boundary of the definition of infrastructure to make sure that it includes digital infrastructure, natural and green infrastructure, and human infrastructure? People who work in these industries are very much backbone of what happens. So kind of, how do you make sure they are protected, the workforce is developed, we have fresh ideas, fresh bodies, fresh minds coming into the industry? How do we help them to professionally grow? So kind of that's the piece. And then the innovation part, often people think about innovation as gadgets. What's the next gadget I can build? But actually innovation can be put in 3 different categories. One is obviously trying to build new future technologies that are important to water, but also innovation in policy. How do we innovate around different pieces of policy that we have to make sure we can create water security? And then also innovation around financing. How do we rethink and reimagine how we help the money to flow, and what are we investing in, and how do we do it? So that's sort of the gist of the report. Obviously, there are ideas there for states to pick up. There are ideas there for federal government to pick up. We try to kind of create a balance between sort of federalism and federal controls, kind of trying to understand what are the pieces that needs to be at the federal level and what needs to happen at local level, and then also trying to have solutions across the board for different parts of the country, different governance bodies and all that.
If you were to kind of look at a Pareto of 80-20 on the biggest bang for your buck on the solution side, against these kind of 6 verticals, whether that be federal or state, in the next year, or pick your time scale, if you had to implement 2 things or 5 things or 1 thing, what would be the solution that you start with?
I mean, I would say trying to create a more unified front at the federal level when it comes to water, especially when it comes to what data do we need what needs, all these discussions we are having about data centers and people are fighting over like who comes in, who goes out, which technology gets to move in. A lot of it is centered around water or affordability. And partly the challenge is no one knows, for example, how much water these facilities are using, or nobody needs to, the reporting is not there, the centralized understanding is not there. So we are kind of fighting in this like dark fight. Everybody thinks they're throwing a punch, but the reality is we don't really understand the room, the form, the shape, any of that. So I would say at the federal level, creating more coordination, creating an Office of Water that can help us with some of that can be super important and beyond. And I would say, but maybe another quick fix around that is also, a lot of our we depend on utilities for delivering water to us and taking water and treating and putting back to the environment. And often, a lot of these are small, medium size. They don't have a lot of capacity to manage the challenges they're facing. And the business model they have belongs to the past century. Take water, clean it, put it in the pipe, deliver it to people, charge them. And often people don't even know they're not paying for water, they're paying for the services that they're receiving. And that model doesn't function. It's not going to help the water sector survive. And, I've just was watching the movie about BlackBerry. I can't remember the name of that movie. I think it was just BlackBerry, called BlackBerry. Yeah. I can't remember. And there was a fascinating line. So I've been talking about water sector needs to change its business model, the utilities. And I do think that's one very, very easily doable and low-hanging fruit, but it's not happening kind of a thing. And the reason I bring up that movie is because there's a part in the movie that they're talking about BlackBerry and Apple are fighting over who's going to take the biggest market share. And BlackBerry, the guy at BlackBerry or someone says, we are counting minutes because if you remember, back then it was all at how many phone calls you're making, how many minutes they count, right? And Apple very quickly the phone industry or telecommunication industry moved on to plans. They figured that counting minutes doesn't work that well. So people are going to count. But if you say, I'm going to give you a plan, now you and I don't even know how much we are using our phone. Some people might not use it at all, but some people may use it over time. But the reality is now there are plans. So you're not constantly dependent on every drop. You're actually thinking about the broader service that's provided, right? And that freed them from that whole minute by minute, small scale thinking. So, and I always think about that when it comes to water. We are so bound to how many drops of water people use and how many, and if we sort of transition to a little bit more holistic way of thinking about the source, the delivery, the discharge, how do you create a better business model around this? And how would we do it in this day and time?
If I'm hearing you correctly, kind of two things here, just kind of saying it back to you. There was a distinct currency shift, or you can call it a currency between BlackBerry and Apple. Of the currency of phones before was around minutes, and Apple said, "Forget the minutes. We're gonna go to plans, and you get the hardware, and then Apple is what Apple is." And tying that thread together with, you said water policy and municipalities were built in the previous century, and we were consuming water, we were drinking water, and then we were using it, and then we had wastewater, we were expelling it. If you kind of pulling the last thing that you said is if you put an umbrella around the three of these and you make almost like a one water or a kind of a holistic water, what is the change in currency? The currency right now is drops. If you were to have a municipality that put two or three of these things together, what are you now paying for? What does that world look like?
Yeah, I think so. There are different ways to think about it. What that world can look like the physical infrastructure that we have is expensive and we need to maintain it. And this is how much it costs to maintain it, regardless of if you're using a drop of water or 1,000 drops of water, right?
Sure.
So that needs to be protected and paid for. Then you can say, depending on how many drops you're using, right? This is how much you're paying. And as you use more, then you need to actually pay even more, right? So then you actually bundle that up on top so that it's the extraction of water and delivery of water in the sense of amount, then it becomes another piece of this plan. And then again, you can tie that to another piece of infrastructure, which is the discharge infrastructure, right? So then again, you can put those two pieces together. You need the infrastructure, and depending on how much discharge you have, there's more energy, there are no more people. So you can bundle this up as a plan and actually say, and I'm just like making this up as we are talking, but it's kind of like point is there are things that we have to pay for, and there are things that then depends on the variability of use. And we can actually bundle all those together in a bigger format. So then you don't want to penalize people who are not using that much water, but you also don't want to leave people behind not having access to clean water because we are not charging people enough. We are not maintaining systems well enough. And if you go back, for example, to Jackson, Mississippi and Flint, Michigan, that everybody talks about when it comes to water, often those problems were the problems of lack of financial management and therefore poor infrastructure maintenance that then started falling apart, right? Much of those decisions were actually financial, not, that's what they were.
So let's actually move to these emerging industries, as you mentioned, right? They're kind of tying a few of your threads together. Water policy and water management was built for last century. We don't have a water plan, and the world today looks very different. We didn't have data centers in 1920s, and so with data centers and mining and these new emergent technologies, what does that world look like? Like what do you think should happen there? I mean, I think we understand if we have this federal plan off of what you said at the Aspen Institute, maybe we'll become a little bit more mature in the way that we talk about who's consuming how much and where the water's going. But let's just double click on that. Like, what does that emerging technologies world look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think people often focus on individual data centers that are coming into their neighborhoods, and often there's a lot of fight over that. The part of that is sort of highlighting the fact that states are enabling this transition because they are hoping for, better tax base and, new companies coming in, potentially jobs. So there are very specific economic values that states are looking at as a way of welcoming these groups in. The challenge is a lot of those decisions are not tied into resource availability, water or energy. So the question is, how do you tie all these pieces together? Because when they come in, then they're impacting local communities, right? Mm-hmm. And if you recall at the beginning, I said, we have so many different water utilities. There's just like thousands and thousands and thousands of tens of thousands of them, actually not even thousands. So that means that every one of these data centers may end up either in the backyard of one community with a utility, or actually sometimes they can cover enough land that have multiple utilities are dealing with them. And each one of these utilities, especially small and medium-sized ones, they are not used to dealing with major users and industries. So the question is, they often don't even know what to ask for. If, for example, one of these hyperscalers comes to you and says, I want to build, or any data centers, I'm not going to even, we talk about hyperscalers because they are the front and center of this discussion. But the reality is you're building data centers super fast, and our digital economy is going to overtake a lot of different things because we're going to be think about autonomous cars, think about, your fridge that decides what you need next. It's just like this ChatGPT and everything. They're just like at the beginning of it, just a baby steps to get to that other world that we are thinking about. So the question is, when they're coming in, what are they trying to do? How do we work with communities? And what do communities ask for, right? They come in my neighborhood. I'm a part of a small water utility. They're like, we want to help you. What am I supposed to ask for? Because I don't even have, I'm barely surviving day by day, let alone having a grand plan of, oh, I want this infrastructure, I want this thing, or I want that thing. So it's very complicated for some of these communities to deal with this new businesses that are coming in. Some are trying to sign a water purchase agreement saying, utility, go build the infrastructure. So we buy that water from you, right? But the question is, a lot of these utilities have never even had a water purchase agreement. They do not really do public-private partnerships. So they don't know the terms. They don't know the risk factors. How do you manage the risk? So how do we help them to think about this? Is there a data source or a documentation that we can go and figure out, okay, if I'm this size utility and I need these, and what terms do I ask for, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like very complicated. There's no uniform way of managing these incoming industries. And for the industries, there's no uniform or blanket policy that helps them know what to do, where to do it, how to do it. Because for them also, the easiest thing is to have some framework through which they can actually work with different states. Even if it's at the state level, it's easier for them than, let's say, for example, you end up in Colorado, and if you're in northern Colorado, you deal with this utility, and then if you're southern Colorado, so it becomes very complicated and time-consuming and burdensome. So that's why it's very important to kind of understand these industries and figure out, and using this time as a way of doing water better. Instead of fighting it, we can identify what are the opportunity areas that we can use this time to actually innovate, work towards, improve systems, improve policies. This is the moment, right? So why not use it in that way rather than fighting it? Because we are going to have a lot of data centers. You want it or not, the way the trend is going, it's not going to stop. So we better know how to do it better.
Totally. Really, really interesting. There was a few things that you alluded to that are really interesting. Like I think Amazon had a case study on how they did their entire warehouse build out 20 or whatever, 15, 20 years ago, when they were building up the 3PL infrastructure. And I think they used to have these CBP, the community benefit partnerships, and they would go into cities and they would have these big warehouses that they were shipping stuff with for Prime. But totally, there was this like infrastructure on how they could work with cities so that they would give back to the community, because they were taking space and land, and they were gonna hire people there. Really, really interesting.
Yeah, and also remember, like warehouses, actually, you brought up something very important. Warehouses are interesting because Amazon probably owns all those warehouses, right? But these data centers, and that's why it said hyperscalers are right now in front and center. Everybody talks about them, but they're not the only ones who are only players in this space. And the reality is these data centers are becoming critical infrastructure, right? So eventually, and I have said this in many different settings, eventually this will be our third leg of utility or fourth leg of utility. We will probably at some point will have data utilities that would own these infrastructure and manage them, because you can't depend on a private business to own and manage a critical infrastructure forever. You have to think about, okay, so if I am company X and I'm building all these data centers and tomorrow I go out of business, what's going to happen to all those data centers, right? So as a critical infrastructure, there needs to be a transition to somebody owning and operating these systems. So that's why it's important to kind of think a little bit bigger than this moment. And to your point, having a model that they can repeat in different locations, or at least within an estate boundary, it helps them to do it better. It helps the community to feel more comfortable. It creates more transparency. Right now, there's no transparency. So it's kind of like, I said, you said, this said, there's no like real information that people can use to make decisions.
Yeah. Illuminating. Really cool. Just in your backyard, actually, I distinctly remember when I was in San Francisco starting my first startup, Y Combinator,
Mm-hmm.
made the SAFE, the Simple Agreement for Future Equity. Because before that, all the startups were using convertible notes and debt, and things were kind of bloating, and you had, interest due after 2 years. There's all these percentage points. There was no real like benchmark and base mark. And so I think YC brought this document in, and then companies like Carta that allowed you to put like your shares or your secondary shares on the market then gave transparency into what valuations were for like a SaaS company or an energy company or a water company.
Absolutely.
Really interesting parallels on kind of what happened 10, 15 years ago in the Bay, and kind of what could be built for.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much innovation that can happen in that space. And again, like it is often people are so focused on this moment, right? What's in front of me, and they lose sight of what bigger opportunities exist. And I think it's good to have that. And I love that example. I think that's a perfect example of how do you create that transparency was created, the market has been created, and all of a sudden all the doors opened up to do things better, to manage them better, to figure out what comes in, what goes out, to track change.
Yeah. Newsha, I love to backcast into your past of what makes Newsha. You have a background in hydrology. You worked at the Pacific Institute with Peter Gleek. These things that you're talking about today, if you can think of a handful of moments through your history that have kind of brought you to today, what would you kind of look back and say, well, these like few things are kind of what hindsight 2020 has kind of made me what I am today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I would just always say, I took a class. So all my degrees are in engineering, and I took a class when I was at the University of Arizona in water policy. It was a core class. And it's important to say because it was a core class and somehow everybody had all the materials and all the tests. So it was often one of those classes that people had to take, but no one did anything for the class because you would get an A. I remember the first time I walked into that class and they gave us a book on water policy, and my jaw dropped. I'm like, what? I make all these models, I make all these things, and then this law from this year says this is how you get water, and then every assumption I had is out the door. So that actually truly changed the trajectory of my career. I finished master's and then did PhD, and then I just went straight to learn about policy. I worked for the legislature in California, and then actually did the time I was there, I did not even I worked a tiny bit on water, but majority of time on energy and transportation and how energy policies have changed and the financing. And that then led into a lot of the work I did beyond when I worked for the legislature. I ended up being appointed to the Water Resources Control Board here in the Bay Area and was on the regulatory side. I worked for San Francisco Public Utilities as a commissioner, again, appointed position. The reason I say these things is because for me, I think my career has always been about somehow I'm able to see patterns across different sectors and ideas that can transcend from one to the other, and be able to kind of see, if you actually take this and move it this way, you can fit it in this space. And I think the whole policy space has helped me with that, because the same way that when you are in, for example, water and you know everything about water, when you are in policy, you know a lot of things about policy, but the same kind of policy model can be applied to different sectors, right? So as long as you know a little bit, you can actually build something very different. And that definitely has helped me. And putting my foot on the ground, being on the regional board, working for the legislature, working as a CFPC has actually helped me to always remember what is at the end of the pipeline, why do I do what I do, and try to kind of be curious and interested and learn and try to bring those learnings back to figure out what kind of research needs to be done to inform change. So I would say the water policy class was definitely a critical point, but the rest of it has always been around, like, I'm always very curious and want to figure out how other systems work. And even though my background is in water, but my education is very much on systems. So maybe that's also another piece of this, like, there's so many similarities among different systems. So it's kind of focusing on what connects them is easy.
Amazing. I love that too. You've said multiple times of people focus way too much on like what is in front of them right now. But if you just opened your eyes and zoomed out a little bit, there are opportunities. There's ways to kind of see the silver lining or turn something that may be negative in front of you into something that could be useful later down the line.
Absolutely. And I think that's key, right? And I guess like this conversation we just had, I didn't know about Carta and all that. Like I didn't know all that background, but very quickly, like you kind of took what I said and said, oh, it's like similar to this. And there are so many analogs that we can use. Again, not a perfect replication, but they're models that we can actually look and see how we can do better. And one key thing I would say is when it comes to water, often at the beginning, we started on the fact that water touches everything. But often in every room that we are making decisions about everything else, we never hear about water. Even the businesses and companies right now under scrutiny for water or data centers or technologies, they started focusing on water because communities started pushing back, right? And so having kind of this central view of water, but it's not the same with energy. Everybody thinks about energy. Energy is expensive, it's essential, it's right in front of you. People think about it a lot more. So being able to think about beyond that when it comes to demand and needs, to figure out what is it how can water fit into this equation, I think is important. And I think water definitely has missed out in being part of this conversation. That's why we have a lot of unintended consequences.
Newsha, we're coming close to the end of recording. I ask everybody this question. Is there a book, a TV show, or a movie that has had a profound impact on the way that you look at the world?
That's a great question. Maybe I say two. One is, I really like the Medici family. I think they're, bad or good. You can love them or hate them, but I like how they took they understood how you can lift a community as you lift yourself, and that's how you leave a mark on the ground. And I think that on the world. And that is very fascinating to me. Like, how can you kind of connect your personal ambitions and personal growth into a broader upbringing of the community and their expansion of their access to things. And I say another thing is there's a book called Cloud Cuckoo Land. And it's a fiction and written by, I want to say, Andrew Doerr. I know for his last name is Doerr. I think my first name is Andrew. The book is fascinating. It follows the three different eras, and one of them is all about these people who are stuck in this spaceship that's going 200 years of traveling, and there's an AI system in there that's supposed to help them to navigate all their challenges. I'm not going to tell you what's going to happen in there, but I love that book because I think it's just provides a very important information and very important value point to me, which is human ingenuity is super important. Human creativity is very important, and we should never lose sight of that because we as humans are capable of imagination and doing things that no other machine can do. And maybe those two books kind of, not in the water sector, but I think it's important to kind of everybody to kind of take a look at it.
Amazing. I love that. Newsha, thank you so much for joining us. This conversation has been absolutely insightful.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it, Ravi.